Hello listeners, and welcome to Plugged In, the energy news podcast from Montel, where we bring you the latest news, issues and changes happening in the energy sector. Today, we're heading north, to Norway, where one of Europe's most important energy systems is under pressure. Hydro reservoirs in the south of the country are running low after an unusually cold winter and a prolonged lack of precipitation. That's already flipped Norway from a major power exporter to a net importer, something we haven't seen in many years. But this isn't just a local weather story. It goes to the heart of the issue shaping Europe's power markets right now. Too much green power, too little grid, and a lack of flexibility. So, how serious is the situation in Norway right now? And are we heading towards a crunch this winter, or will the system rebalance? To set the scene, I'm joined by Gert Ove Mollestad, desk editor for Montel News in Norway. Welcome to Plugged In, Gert.
Thank you.
We're talking about low hydrological levels in Norway. Can you briefly explain to us why they are so low at the moment in certain parts of Norway?
The main reason, well, there are two main reasons. We had a very cold winter, the coldest winter in 16 years. So we had a high domestic consumption here in Norway and on the Nordic region from the start of the year. And then only in Norway, we had 15 terawatt hours less precipitation than normal, only in the first quarter. So
we're trying to play catch up.
Yeah, precisely. The nice weather has continued in April, so we are really short on precipitation this year compared to normal level.
But this is mainly in southern Norway, right?
We have a lot of water in northern Norway in the reservoirs from last year. They are not full, but they are really at healthy levels. While in the southern Norway, we have really low levels, both in reservoirs, and there are very little snow in the mountains. So that usually melts now in spring, but the reservoirs will not receive as much water as they normally do.
How serious is this from an energy security perspective, both for Norway and for the region as a whole?
Well, the governments are not concerned at the moment, and Statnett is also saying that the supply situation is normal. But we saw that we went from normal power exports in January to starting importing power imports both in February, March and April, and that is quite unusual. You have to go back to 2019 to see something similar. Last year, Norway exported almost 23 terawatt hours net exports for the year, but now, as far as we are in the year now, we are below zero. So we have gone from being a power supplier to Europe to be a net importer.
That's very interesting, but that also shows the importance of those cables for Norway, doesn't it not?
Absolutely. They in this situation they helps the security of supply.
What are your expectations? What are the market expectations ahead of winter? Are we heading for a supply crunch, or could the system be alleviated? I mean, it's very weather dependent, of course.
Precisely. So if we get a really wet and a bad summer with a lot of rain and a lot of wind, then stocks can be refilled quite quickly. If the dry weather continues, then we will be in a more and more depleted situation. But some weather models now are turning a bit wetter, so the situation is not that pressed at the moment.
As you know, we would like a dry, hot summer, wouldn't we not get? But maybe as power customers and looking at the energy security situation, maybe that's not the most ideal situation ahead of winter.
No, at least for businesses, it will be very good to have some really some wet weeks at least, maybe in the summer or to the autumn to get a really good refill of the reservoirs.
Gert, thank you very much for joining Plugged In again.
No worries.
So that's the situation on the ground. Low reservoirs, a weather-dependent outlook, and a system that's already shifting from export to import. But to really understand what happens next, we need to go deeper into the forecasts, the market dynamics, and the structural pressure shaping the Nordic power system. Well, I'm very pleased to be joined by three of the foremost experts on Norwegian hydropower and the market dynamics. So, Katinka Borgard, the founder and managing director of Volt Power Analytics, a warm welcome to you.
Thanks, Ty. Thanks for having me.
Ivan Føde Svergården, head of energy analysis and weather risk management at Trade W Power. Warm welcome to you as well.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
And last but certainly not least, Torgeir Lilleholt, who's head of analysis at Volue Data and Forecast. Welcome back to the pod, Torgeir.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to join you. Thank you.
If I can start really by looking at, we're going to be talking about hydrological levels in Norway and if that's a concern or not. Now, if I can start with you, Katinka, how unusual are current reservoir levels in southern Norway compared to previous years?
Yeah, so it's definitely an interesting situation. I think we're at one of the most extreme hydrological balance levels for NO2 over the last 10 years and also for Norway as a whole. So it's definitely one of the lower levels we've seen. But on the reservoir side, the reservoir levels are also low, but and not necessarily at the supercritical level yet.
Mm-hmm. What's your view here, Ivan?
Well, they will then be low after the snow melting for sure. They will be largely dependent on how summer weather will be, if we are heading into a winter crisis or not.
Exactly. So that basically means if it's going to be a dry or wet summer.
Yeah.
What are your feelings today? Should we be concerned here?
I was more concerned in the middle of the winter because the spring culmination could go low, but now we start filling the reservoirs already. So what's going on in the summer is not that important. I think that we could go even 10% lower in the spring culmination before we are at a very low level. That has been the minimum before. So I think we are at an okay place, but as Ivan mentioned here, the next 6 months will be crucial for what we will face for the next winter, because that will be actually the next spring 2027 will be the key point if we have a difficult situation or something in the future.
Absolutely, as ever, it's all dependent on weather. And Katinka, what are the key weather and inflow assumptions that are driving current forecasts?
Yeah, so from our perspective, or from our forecast now, we have about a snow deficit across all of the Nordic price zones for the hydro areas. And we expect that the next few weeks also, and during the melting season, that we'll have below normal inflow, and also for the summer, like it's been mentioned already. So we are seeing an interesting situation for the snow for sure, and also if there's any uncertainty around how much snow we actually have stored in the different zones. I think that is either if it's underestimated or overestimated, I think that'll have a quite important impact as well. And also for precipitation and looking ahead on that, I think we also have the situation is close to normal, but normal right now in this period doesn't mean much precipitation. So the chance of kind of compensating for this large deficit that we have on the hydrological balance is quite limited and low for this time of year, I would say.
So are you concerned, Katinka?
No, I mean, I have the same perspectives as both Tor and Ivan. I think it looks okay now, and next winters and the next spring or the next year is the most interesting. When we get that far, there's a lot of dependency on the weather over the next half a year.
Absolutely. And if I could just ask you to explain one concept, that's snow storage. I mean, Katinka, because for the listeners who are not based in Norway or other mountainous regions may struggle to understand what you mean by that.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm the most qualified. Maybe Ivan would be more qualified to answer that. But at a high level, I think a lot of different analogies have been used. But for example, that power and the energy is stored as snow that would run into the reservoirs, like some type of, I think some have drawn the analogy of a battery, that there's stored energy there. And when the temperatures pick up in the mountains above zero, then it melts and runs into the reservoirs, for example. So there's energy stored in the snow.
That's very helpful, Katinka. Thank you very much. I think it's a kind of concept. So it's basically not just snow lying on the ground, is it, Ivan? But it's also, basically that's frozen underground and also in the lakes and rivers and the mountains, right?
Yeah, soil, ground, and everything. And that will be so interesting because my calculations are that we are probably overestimating snow a little bit. That is less snow than what is actually in the mountains. And that will be seen within some few weeks when we get some milder and low pressure activity into late May and June, when the snow melting in higher latitudes, altitude starts. You will probably see lower inflow than expected, which would be a good early sign of that models are probably overestimating snow pack.
I want to return to that, Ivan, but Tor, you want to come in with a comment on it?
Actually, I won't comment on that because I see a lot of analysis starting at zero when they start a new accumulation of the snowpack in September. But we saw that in the end of the autumn last year, it was almost 5 terawatt hours surplus in the soil and groundwater. So if you start the model at the wrong starting point, you actually get some surprises there as well. Because in Sweden, for example, you have seen very high inflow through the whole winter. So that has contributed to the reservoirs in Sweden, at least. So I agree with you. We could see less snow melting, but I think there's a good soil and groundwater back from last autumn that is supporting us.
But Ivan, if I can just return to you and you can ask you about regional variations. I mean, we're talking, Katinka mentioned NO2, which is the southern Norway, but what's the situation like in the rest of Norway, potentially even into Sweden?
Well, NO4s have plenty of water and often have very wet and windy weather during this time of the year. So I don't think there will be any issue at all up north. They will have to supply south. The main issue is how much snow is it in South Norway and the soil ground situation there. And what will reservoirs be after the spring months. And a dry and a hot summer this year will be, as I see it, quite painful for water values because they have to be up to winter price levels. But if we get a wet and windy summer, then I don't think it will be any crisis this year, but it depends on how the situation are into the autumn and before the winter starts.
Absolutely. I mean, I know, Tord, you're based in southern Norway, and obviously a wet and dry summer would be very nice for your summer vacation, but maybe not so good for the security of supply for the coming winter. But Katinka, so, I mean, can you talk us a little bit about your forecast in terms of the sort of rainfall or the weather that you have at the moment? What's your current outlook?
I mean, we're mainly looking at like the front, like the 46-day ahead, and or up to the 46-day ahead. We have a quite normal, like I said, situation with precipitation for actually all of the south and also Sweden. But then, like I said, for the normal isn't that helpful, or there's not that much precipitation in the normal in the May and these days, so it's not necessarily going to bring a lot of precipitation to help the deficit that we have right now. But it looks close to normal, slightly above for the zones.
So is that a view you share here, Tord?
Yeah, it's not difficult to use more on the 46 days. I've looked into the seasonal weather forecast. Of course, that is not good. Looking at they didn't hit the temperature in February, they didn't hit the temperature in March. So I think that is difficult. But we have some views on the El Nino, and that could be interesting. Of course, this more focus on the Pacific, extreme weather conditions there. Don't know how important it will be for the European market, but it could be some signs that it could be a dry summer and it could also be a cold winter. A dry summer means also high temperature, so a lot of solar production during the summer could be nice, but also a cold winter could be expected. But that is very long time, and to be honest, I've seen this weather and 6 months ahead of us. Everything can happen. It could be wet, it could be dry.
Exactly. So, and seasonal forecasts are notoriously difficult, aren't they not, Ivan?
Well, that actually depends, because I've developed an AI model that I have researched over the last 40 years. I use energy quantified inputs and also to read all the traditional forecasts. And I mapped every week the last 40 years and see what was causing those weather events per week. And then I look at what is now. And it's pretty clear that we are heading towards a wet and windy accumulatedly summer for Q3 Nordics, which typically means some windy and wet periods down to Germany as well, which means we'll have plenty of renewables, and the reservoirs levels will gain some levels on imports and also through inflow. So this summer won't be that tight, but typically in these summers when you have a Q3 that is wet and windy, which has been seen the last 6 years, often that you have this kind of a cold, wet, windy Nordic flow, and that means also you don't get very stable hot spell down in Europe, definitely not for Germany and down to France in periods, is that typically follows a dry spring and autumn after. If you have a wet summer, you typically have a dry autumn. So in some, if you look at the statistical correlations with the last 40 years, and I rule out like 25 years for the Q3 outlook, and I see what is happening in all those years, it's heading to a wet one and a windy one, which will be okay, no disaster. But then you follow typically with a dry and calm Q4. So in some, you will still end up before December in this method quite tight.
And what does El Nino, what does that mean for European, weather or European power markets, if you like, energy markets? What's the impact? As Torgeir said, it was mainly focused on the Pacific.
I don't find very strong correlations with Europe weather, especially not Nordics. But what you can say is that the potential for extremely hot spells, and especially in Asia, is high, and also in South Europe is high this summer. But since I see these westerly lows passing by Scandinavia, they will pull cold air masses south down to Germany and France and cut off hot spells. So hot spells will probably develop, but they won't be that long. They won't last so long. So cooling demand will not be that stable high this summer based on this thinking. So any cooling demand and heating issues will come from very hot US and hot Asia and South Europe based on such analysis. But the problem will be then that you get a surplus of hydro into the summer, both through precipitation, probably import will be a lot. You will have a lot of negative prices from Germany, but you get the pain back in Q4. Then it shifts, and this total amount of precipitations during this thinking is not actually strongly surplus because you get the deficit in Q4 and the surplus in Q3.
No, very, very interesting, fascinating weather patterns, weather developments there. But I think obviously a very hot summer in Asia and the US and potential Southern Europe will have impacts on general power prices in Europe through the key factor of LNG, will it not, and other aspects as well. But very, very good point. So Katinka, if we come back to Norway and have the discussion around so hydropower producers in the country, how would they optimize their reservoir usage in the weeks and months ahead? What's your view here?
I think we've seen a few examples of it over the last few weeks and month in southern Norway with how the solar is coming online or really ramping up on the continent, and that we're seeing periods with imports from Germany and the continent into NO2 and maybe full imports, and then we're actually decoupling. I think that's something that we'll see more and more of. And as we look ahead towards 2030, we actually see a lot of this or a lot more active usage of these interconnectors switching between imports and exports from NO2, especially during the solar peak hours. Looking at the other, I think that naturally would shape or change the shape of the production or how the hydropower producers are choosing to produce, and also how they need to plan into the future as well, and how much uncertainty or how if the volumes on the renewable side increase as quickly and ramp up as quickly as it seems to be over the next few years based on our analysis, that there will be a need to really shift in the way that they are choosing to produce now or in the winter, because they might actually risk a bit more spillage than before and have a lower water value in the front of the curve, at least in our analysis.
So I think the key that power interconnectors will increase the complexity, but also will come to the rescue in some hours and some days potentially for Southern Europe in particular. Torgeir, do you think the markets and maybe politicians, maybe us journalists, I think, are overreacting to hydro deficits and, for example?
Yeah, I think so, because I think there's a pattern here that we are underestimating the new renewable onboarding. I think compared to last year, I think this year we might see 150 terawatt hours more solar and wind in Europe in total. And if you add that into capacity in the midday hours, actually Germany alone will add 5,000 megawatts of solar peak. You will add more than 1,000 megawatts of wind power during the middle of the summer. So in total, all over the continental area, you will add a lot of new renewables, and you will see more negative hours, more snorkeling hours, what they call it, in the middle of the day. And that will also affect the Nordic hydro producers, because they will save all the hours, and every day through the summer now, I think 5 to 10 hours will be importing from Germany. And if you have normal wind, you also import from UK. So the change in UK wind is also extreme. And based on that, you see now that the hydro producers should lower the hydro reservoir more during the summer or during the spring, because they make room for more production from continental low-priced hours. And then you will actually save water during the summer, and you have a better hydro surplus or less deficit in the autumn permanation. And also during the winter time, you have to produce more at fewer hours to empty the reservoirs, because new renewable take hours from the hydro. So the change will be a pattern here, but will be more and more evident year by year in the next future. And batteries might be something that could limit it, but I think the changes will be there. So during the next 3-4 months, we actually halve the deficit in hydro due to this effect. So we're down to 10 terawatt-hours deficit.
It's very interesting, Tore. So the huge amounts of subsidized or still remaining subsidized German solar is coming to the rescue here and helping out hydro producers save for the winter. I think that's very interesting in terms of how the cable's utilized and how that's really coming to the aid of southern Norway, something that's maybe not often reported.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that is something we might look at this, but we are just knocking on the door to the summer now. So it's just started. And through the whole winter, we actually saw this pattern. In Spain, we have already now 600 hours close to that negative. And before June is set, I think we set a new record in new negative 0 hours in Spain. And that will be the same effect for France, for Germany, and also actually Poland now have a lot of negative hours. So it will be the whole Europe that will see the same effect.
I think that's. I'd like to move on to that in a minute. But first of all, Tore, can you explain what you said? Did you say a snorkel pattern? What did you say?
We have seen a pattern, actually, that there's a lot of hours just below zero or above zero. So you're just snorkeling the surface here, and that has been the trend. We actually saw a trend that you see less very deep negative prices. So that surprised me a bit now. Last week in the 1st of May, we actually didn't manage to avoid the minus 500 record low prices. And now we have lowered the limit for negative bids down to 600 euros. So I think that is also interesting that the batteries and all the other effects, the bidding strategy and everything has not avoided the very deep prices this spring, and it could be even worse during summer. But it was extreme days with it was a public holiday. Lot of wind, lot of solar at the same time, so definitely. But we see pattern already next weekend, Saturday, Sunday, same situation. So we will repeat itself during the whole summer.
That's an astonishing change and quite amazingly low prices. I think, Ivan. I mean, we saw minus 500, for example, across continental Europe. My first question would be, what's driving this? And the second one would be, why are the Nordics been unaffected largely, or they're just snorkeling, as Tore says?
I think that is, all agrees, renewables. Solar and wind, especially solar, it's knocking us. When you have wind, you still have solar, and then that gets an oversupply. They can produce on negative prices, and boom, you get negative Swiss price. And I think that is something that you will experience. But as soon as wind is shutting down and you get low wind, you see winter prices. Then SRMse and water values are setting on winter price levels. And as soon as wind is back, boom, you get the collapse, especially during daytime when you have the solar, which benefits Nordic power because you can import during that time. And this summer, I think that will be helpful a lot of the deficit you see in the hydro situation, as long as summer is then accumulately wet and windy. This disconnect of water values and as Adam said, when it's solar and wind, it's going to be very hard to set the average prices, but we have shut it down so much baseload supply. So if prices are going to explode when it's like 1.5 week calm, or are they going to be crushed if it's 1.5 week windy with some solar, that sets the entire setup, and that sets how much import hydro producers in Nordics will get. And you see prices in Germany plus 300 to minus 800 depending on wind and solar. And that's going to be very challenging with this Iran war. If it escalates and you have some LNG issues and cooling demand in Asia and some fighting of LNG, let's say more LNG facilities will be taken off market by the war and so on. So this is going to be a little bit nightmare to navigate, and it's going to be huge volatility depending on how much renewables you will have. And like a switch on off, I call it more like binary pricing. If it's wet and windy, it collapses. If it's calm, preferably below the 25% of the wind, prices boom follow winter prices on water values and SRMse.
But then if you have the solar as well in combination with that adds the complexity, but also to the driving them down, right?
Yeah. Solar is the tipping point. If you didn't have solar, prices wouldn't be that low. When wind comes, you always have some solar, even though it's cloudy, and the solar add-on is the one that breaks prices as I see it.
Actually, this week is a good example because next couple of days we will have only 30 gigawatt solar production in Germany, but in 2 days after that it will be 60. So you double the solar capacity or solar production in the middle of the day. So you see the amount of megawatts that will shift back and forth. That is only one example from Germany, but you see that for the whole European area. So it really matters. And I'm a bit concerned about how to capture all this energy because looking at the UK offshore wind, more than 10 terawatt hours curtailment last year. And it's more than 10% more than for all the production that is not been able to utilize. You see the same in solar, you see the same in wind all over Europe now. So the hydropower is actually something that is helping this system now a lot, and we have a benefit to be flexible, definitely.
I think that's a very good point, Ture, that this energy is going to waste. We need to find ways of capture it to make sure that we use it. But and question before I turn to Katinka, Ture, in terms of negative prices, but we see them mostly at weekends, right, or when there's a national holiday. Can you foresee a situation where you'd have them on a working day, a normal sort of Monday to a Friday, in the same extent as we see on Saturdays and Sundays?
I see that pattern already now. You will see it every day, unless it's low wind scenario. So low wind scenario, then you don't have it. Then you will see more need for gas. But also on weekdays, we will see low patterns every day. And actually the night hours still are up at gas production, but I think that could also be set at a test closer to the summer because consumption will go down in the next couple of months as well. So I feel it very strange if you look at the prices in Germany. It's picking up in the market now every month from April, May, June and July, August up to more than 90 euros. In my trend, it should go down compared to the prices you have seen the past month.
Because there's a disconnect between the financial market and the physical reality. Yes, yeah. That's interesting as well. Katinka, what's your view on negative prices? Do you think we're only just seeing the beginning and that we can expect to see more going forward?
So I think, that's that we're already seeing records for 2026. I think obviously the battery development or the capacity build on batteries we need a lot in order to account for these negative 500 hours and bring them up above zero. So I think for most of the markets, we do expect that it will increase. And then obviously given, for example, the hydro situation in the Nordics, that obviously not necessarily relevant for records in NO2, but for other really renewable solar, wind, heavy systems, then we do expect it to increase from our perspective at least for the front years. Yeah.
So, and Ivan, are we at the critical stage now in terms of negative prices? Because this is the massive influx of solar. It's happening now in May, potentially in June. This is where it's sort of peak solar, if you like, May and June. So this is where we're likely to see these patterns that you three have been talking about for the coming weeks, in terms of extreme volatility and the deep prices and the very high prices when there's low wind.
Yeah. Wind sets the levels, how negative it would be, because solar alone is not enough. But when you have wind and solar, you get the very strong negative prices. And I think also over time, I'm curious about if this will destroy part of the market, that this will self-regulate, because solar and wind making money. But if these are getting too negative prices through this summer, it could even affect investments and profitability of a lot of the energy companies the next 4, 5, 6, 7 years if this continues, and the willingness to invest. So I also talked to myself that I'm not sure if this is actually will be benefits in the long term. I think it will mess up the investment appetite. It could be too negative if you have a very, very summer this Q3 and you have a lot of negative prices. And also traders, they need to focus closer in on their decision making, because making a call next year, who knows what happens, So it would change the entire structure to a little bit more nervous meteorological nightmare scenario, where if you had 1 week wet and windy and then you have 1 week very dry and calm, you're going to have insane volatility.
What's your view, Ture? Do you think then that this would scare away investors? Are we already seeing that, or would it incentivize investors into what Katinka was talking about, like increased batteries and flexibility and industries that can use that power when it's available in that sense?
It will trigger battery investors. It will definitely scare the solar and wind investors for sure. And I can see the capture price rates will go down. It's down to 50% already. And but what I want to comment as well, you talked about the Nordic. I'm not scared about the southern part of Norway due to the hydro situation. Don't think a lot of negative prices will occur there. But look at NO4, actually not due to a lot of surplus of power, but they have a grid constraints that definitely are based or created by the flow-based market coupling. So that is a totally different situation, that they are now more negative hours than Germany. And they are going very deep because they have a social benefit of not producing. So Sweden, Fosen, the wind park is putting power into NO4, and they are drowning in power. So that is actually a situation that they are not satisfied with the Statnet's decision that they will lock out the industry in the future, because there are a lot of power there. They have the lowest prices in Europe, and still they don't need, they can't connect more consumption in the future. So it's a desperate situation for NO4.
Yeah.
This NO4, can you explain to those listeners that aren't familiar with the area codes, the price zones in the Nordics, Tor?
Yeah, it's from the upper north in Norway, and of course it's a situation. There's a surplus there, and that's totally different from the deficit that we have in south of Norway. And they have a lot of power. Have seen surplus now for 5 years, so the prices has been closed down to between 10 and 20 euros now for 5 years. So in a desperate situation and not earning money for their production. They had a break in January, February. Suddenly they have the same price as southern part of Norway, and that was surviving a lot for the income in that area. So they struggle to actually earn money on any production in the northern part of Norway.
Certainly very concerning, Tor, and that's also the link to this is the fact that, as you mentioned, the TSO Statnet has placed restrictions on new grid connections in the area for industry who could potentially utilise this power surplus. So that's obviously a massive concern and a very different situation.
We need more grid for sure, more grid for all this production, and then you can utilise more of it. Grid is as much as important as batteries, I guess.
Absolutely. Do you agree there, Ivan? More grid, more grids?
Yeah, you saw Nordkraft boss came out and was very frustrated in the papers here recently, and I agreed to that. That if you add renewables and you don't expand the grid and flexibility, then you will sooner or later, as I see it, mess up the entire system, because this would cause a chaos that is really hard to navigate as a producer, as a trader, as an analyst, investments, and so on and so on. And if this starts rolling negative, it's going to be hard to turn around. So I think we are in a very exciting time for energy safety and investments and opportunities and so on the next few years. I think we'll get announced within 2030. And also, since we have shut down so much baseload supply, if you have one really dry and calm year, like minus 30, 40 terawatt hours a year, and you don't have baseload in Europe, and you get a huge deficit in Nordics, let's say this summer ended up 20 terawatt hours deficit, a really hot summer like 2018 or something. Yeah, what then? We don't have power then. we really have to turn off. So for me, I call it a little bit like the EU green madness. I love the renewables betting. I agree to all of it. But for me, it's not completely evaluated overall implementation plan. The chaos is already starting, and it's going to get worse.
It's a fascinating discussion and debate. I'm going to have to draw it to a close. But do you think it's not just about installing renewables, whether it's solar, wind, hydro, whatever it may be, Katinka? It's also about everything that comes with it, flexibility options and grid primarily. Is that something that you'd share?
Yeah, I think also, when these types of challenges arise, a lot of exciting new opportunities also arise for businesses and different solutions. So let's see what happens over the next few years. It's definitely exciting times, I agree with Ivan.
Absolutely. Certainly, I think it's going to keep all of us busy anyway. So Ivan, Torgeir and Katinka, thank you very much for being guests on Plugged In Podcast this week.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rika.
Thank you.
And you listeners, thanks for listening to this episode of Plugged In. If you enjoyed this discussion, please like, rate, and follow to make sure you get the latest podcast episodes as soon as we release them every Friday. We'd also love to read your reviews of the podcast. It helps us to keep up to date with what you, our listeners, think of our podcast and what content you want to receive more of. Finally, you can head to montelnews.com for more news and analysis from our team of journalists across Europe and beyond. See you next time.